Okay, welcome everybody to Evening Sessions. Evening Sessions is a monthly program series featuring fun, engaging presentations, lectures, workshops, demonstrations, author visits, and performances on topics covering the arts, culture, history, science, and more. This evening session is going to be Bryant on the Titanic, but just to let you know, next month's evening session is Wednesday, October 21st. The author, Nicole Beauchamp, will be talking about her new book available here at the library and on Amazon, titled Haunted Bay City, Michigan. You can register through our homepage or watch us live on Facebook. And to keep aware of our upcoming programs, don't forget to register for our library newsletter. Al, who's going to be talking about the Titanic, is a native of Michigan. He's a retired librarian. Yay, librarians. And he continues to volunteer at his local library. So I'm going to let Al take over from here, and I hope everyone enjoys.
Okay, thank you, Rochelle. Again, my name is Al Bryant. I'm coming to you live from Frankfort, Michigan. Titanic has been a fascination of mine for many years, many years. At the age of 10, my parents were watching the 1953 movie Titanic, and in it my mother explained how my great-grandfather had gone to England to see his mother, and when he was coming back he had just missed being on the Titanic. Well, yes, he did just miss it. As an adult, when I learned about things like passenger lists for coming over here, he missed it by 2 years. He came over in 1910. The keel of the Titanic wasn't laid until 1911. So, no, he wasn't. I have a cousin that was on the Titanic we'll talk about in a few minutes. So I do have a connection with it. But I've just been very fascinated by it over the years. There are people that are much more knowledgeable than I. There are people that can tell you every person that stayed in every cabin. They can look at you and say, John Jacob Astor lived in or stayed in cabin A4. I have warned my friends, if I ever get to the point I can tell you who was in every cannon or every cottage, feel free to shoot me, because that's a little more than I want to do. Just to, warn you about behavioring. Titanic was, as I said, keel was laid 1911. It was actually launched and set sail in 1912. It was actually owned by the man on the right, J. Pierpont Morgan. He was a railroad baron, well, robber baron too, who basically had a monopoly on the railroads. He wanted one on shipping too. So he bought several steamship lines and merged them into what was called the International Mercantile Marine. It was owned totally by J.P. Morgan, no stock holders, no nothing, just he owned it. So it was an American-made ship. It was British registry, but an American-made ship. If he looks familiar at all, you may have seen caricatures of him on Monopoly sets. He is the one that is the basis for the little man in the mustache and the top hat on Monopoly sets. On the left is J. Bruce Ismay. He was the chairman of the White Star Line, who was one of the lines that J.P. Morgan owned. He was basically a figurehead, but he was an interesting figurehead. He was rather pompous. He was rather full of himself, and he was very wealthy. But the man that's probably the most influential is Thomas Andrews. He was the architect, he was the builder of the Titanic. He's also one of my heroes. This is where they started putting together the blueprints for the Titanic, and you can see what a huge project that was. Titanic was the largest ship that was ever built at that point. It was 882 feet long. It could not compete with the Cunard Line as far as speed was concerned. The fastest ship was called the Mauretania, but Titanic was going to be the most luxurious ship. So they held back no money on making it the ship. Again, the keel was built in late in 1911. They had to take 3 of those gantries and cut it up for 2 because the ships were so big. The one on the left would have been for the Olympic, and then the one in the white is the Titanic. And there the Titanic is after it was launched. When the Titanic was launched, there was no great fanfare for it. They just built ships and pushed them in the water, as they said. There was no christening, no bottle of champagne or anything. But again, it was the largest ship. It had twins. One was the Olympic, which was the first one built, and then the Titanic that was a little different, so it was actually heavier. So it was a bigger ship than the Olympic. The third one was going to be called the Gigantic. However, after the Titanic sunk, they all sort of put their heads together and decided that was a little tacky. So that was renamed the Britannic. The Olympic served very well and was eventually sold and broken up. The Britannic was turned into a hospital ship in World War I and sank via a German mine in the Mediterranean. Titanic, as I said, was 882 feet, 45,000 tonnage. It could make up to 24 knots an hour, which was a very good speed. But the whole idea, of course, was luxury, not speed. It had about 2,200 souls on board, including the crew and the officers and the first, second, and third class. First class, it was just luxurious. This is, of course, the famous stairway in first class. If you've seen the James Cameron movie Titanic, this is the one you see a lot. And at the end, this is the one that's lined up with victims of the Titanic who have come back to life to welcome Jack. First class was, again, exquisite. Second class was actually quite nice. Second class is what would have been first class on most every other ship. Third class, which was steerage, were still actually very nice for steerage. They had their own dining room. They had toilets, which sounds odd to us, but a lot of the third class passengers had never seen a toilet. They were all coming to America. They were the bread and butter of the White Star Line or any of the others. The first class paid the most money, but the steerage is what kept them going. Titanic officers. The officers tended to be, usually there were 7 officers besides the captain. The captain was E.J. Smith, who is on the left and on the far right. He was the Commodore of the White Star Line. He was going to retire after this voyage. He was the official one that always took ships on their maiden voyage. He had never had a major accident of any kind, so he was a little too sure of himself. The other officers are William Murdoch, the purser. Next to him was Third Officer Boxall, and then Captain Smith. First class cabin. Again, the first class had several rooms to it. The third class would be with bunk beds and like that, but still, it was far classier than any other ship would have been. Whoops. The Titanic had certain firsts involved. They were the first ship to have a swimming pool. This was seawater. It was not heated, but it was an indoor shipboard swimming pool, or swimming baths, as they called it. It's also the first ship, as we'll get into, first ship to use the SOS as a distress call. And it was the first ship that they ever tried to actually recover bodies from. Up till then, it was sort of, well, there they are. This is the trip of the Titanic. It started in Southampton, went to Cherbourg in France, then went to Queenstown. Now, Queenstown, which is not called that now, it's called Cobb, I believe. Once Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, became separate from England, was their last stop. It was also the city that had most of the crew from. Now, the crew was almost entirely British. So there are maps of the streets where all the crew members who passed away lived, and yeah, it's just amazing. You can't imagine that kind of devastation that would come to a town now. And then it follows across the Atlantic until it hits position 4144 north, 5024 west, about 400 miles south of the Grand Banks. It took them, at this point, 4 days. They started on the 10th, and it was the 14th when they actually struck the berg, headed for New York, which of course they would never make. Up till then, the cruise had been just wonderful. They were so impressed. The food was marvelous. The entertainment was just superb. Part of the entertainment was the Titanic band, which really wasn't a band. It was actually two small orchestras, a trio and a quintet. The quintet played in the first class dining room, and the trio played in one of the alternate dining areas called the a la carte cafe, where you could get things off a particular menu. So not until the night they sank had the band ever played as one. Also, they were all string, so they're not a band. The only difference was there were two pianos, but everything else was string. They're sailing along. Everything's wonderful until about 11:30 on April 14th. Now, first of all, keep in mind the times I talk about are the times that were actually on the ship. They aren't New York time or London. It's just what that time would have been in the middle of the Atlantic. They saw an iceberg ahead of them, They tried to turn to miss it. It was a very calm night, so they had a lot of problems trying to see anything that would be unusual. So they turned left, and it scraped along the starboard side toward the bow. Now the ship was built, as we all know, it was called unsinkable. It was built to withstand either running head on into like a berg or whatever, smack head on, or it was designed to be what we call now T-boned. It was designed to have the first 4 compartments flooded, or it could take any 5 compartments flooded. However, with the damage to the side, it ended up with 6 compartments. Unfortunately, it could not. Also, as you can tell, the watertight compartments are there by the black lines, but they have no tops, which means as the ship sank, the water would run from compartment 6, go over the top, and start filling compartment 7, something they had never anticipated. Again, they thought it would either be head-on or T-boned. So it became a mathematical certainty that they were going to sink. Again, this was unthinkable, impossible, but that is what was happening. Okay. It was, let's go back to this one. It was, just incomprehensible, as well as it took 2.5 hours to sink. Therefore, for a long time, the ship looked far safer than lifeboats would. So a lot of people just stayed on the ship because it was like an island there versus these little boats. They ordered everyone to lifeboats, and it took people quite a while to do that. Some of the lifeboats were launched half empty. They would hold at least 60 people, and some of them went down on 28 people or 30 people. One boat went down with 12, or was launched with 12 people, which caused a couple problems, one of which obviously the 12 people. Second of all, it was the main passengers on it, in fact the only passengers, were the Duff Gordons and their secretary, Miss Francatelli. The rest were crew, a dozen of them, and the crew was bemoaning the fact that their paychecks stopped as soon as the Titanic went underwater, as soon as the stern went under. So Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon gave them all 5-pound drafts, like a check, so they could start, getting clothes and like that. Unfortunately, it tended to look like they were getting bribed to only have 12 people on the boat. So that has caused some problems. As they went farther, more people filled the boat. By the time they got to the last boat, which was Lifeboat 13, which would be toward the stern, that was full. The number of lifeboats they had on the Titanic were 16 regular lifeboats and 4 what they called collapsible, which would be like a wooden floor, but the sides were canvas, waterproof, of course. It would take care of maybe a third of the passengers. They were never designed to take all of the passengers. They would have had to have like 24 boats, lifeboats, and the company, in fact, it was J. Bruce Ismay, who said, no, we don't want to inconvenience are first-class passengers. So they had these few boats, even though they would have needed a lot more. And some of them went down empty. Generally, everybody was pretty calm about leaving the boat. There was at one point towards the end, Fifth Officer Lowe had to fire a gun. They were all issued, the officers were issued pistols to hold some people back. But generally, they were pretty much calm and collected. As it sank, more and more people went to the stern because that was the last to go down. That was sort of their salvation, they thought. In fact, they didn't think the Titanic would ever sink. A lot of the passengers just assumed that once the front part fell off, we'll talk about that in a minute, the stern part would sort of become its own lifeboat, which of course didn't happen. If you've seen the camera in Titanic, that's where you've seen where Jack and Rose were on the back end and jumped off as it sank. About 1,500 people were lost in the Titanic. 705 were saved. They were the ones that showed up on the rescue ship. One of the debates has been, how did these people die? We talk about they drowned. A lot of the tombstones will say they drowned, but they didn't. Most, as far as we can tell, most of the people died of hypothermia. The ocean was 28 degrees. You don't last long in 28 degrees. If you were to jump, then you've got injuries involved. First of all, you'd have to jump feet first, and most people didn't. Most people dived. Second of all, as you can see on the life jacket, they were made of basically bricks of cork. And if you jumped the right way, you still had a problem because once you hit that water, the entire life jacket came up and it would hit your head and it would snap your neck. So it was going to kill you anyway, unless you took your arms, crossed them and held on to the top of the life jacket, which they were never instructed to do. Some did drown, primarily those that were caught inside the ship. Perhaps they never got out of their cabins. A lot of the third class were still below, and they drowned. So the three main things were hypothermia, drowning, and injury. Most of the bodies stayed on the surface, with the exception of those that were caught inside the ship. Eventually, a lot of them sank, eventually, and you can see remains of them around the Titanic today. When I say remains, I don't mean any part of the body. I mean shoes or a leather coat, because they were all tanned and they would not have decomposed underwater. But this is what you would have seen a lot of in the water. Famous passengers that were involved were, upper left-hand corner, John Jacob Astor, the richest man in the world. If you mailed a letter to the richest man in the world and just left it that, the post office would deliver it to him in New York. He was on the Titanic because he and his wife Madeline had been in Europe and the Middle East. There was a reason he had to get out of town. He had been married for 49 years, I think it was 49, to a very nice woman who he all of a sudden divorced. Then he married this woman, Madeline. You can't tell from the picture, but Madeline was 19. So there was scandal involved. So they went to Europe till it blew over. Then they found out Madeline was pregnant, so they came back as fast as they could. Below him is Major Archibald Butt, who was a military advisor for President Taft. The others are just basically assorted people. The bottom couple there are Isa and Isidore Strauss. They are the founders of Macy's department store. They were both lost. Theirs is the famous story of when they got to a lifeboat, they put Ida in the boat and then she got out because they wouldn't let Isidore in because he was a man. And she basically said, no, I've been married this long. Where he goes, I go. So they both were lost on the ship. At this point, it was, depending on what side of the ship you were on, it was women and children first. The port side was very, very strict about that, women and children. The starboard side, not so much. That's where quite a few of the men managed to survive getting into boats from there. The one in the lower left-hand corner is Blanche Beckwith, who was a survivor. If you're into the Titanic, as strange as it sounds, you end up with favorite survivors. Blanche is not one of them for me. She sort of, I mean, she was very knowledgeable, but a little whiny. There was another one, Eva Hart, who was gutsy, to say the least. She was my favorite. The heroes of the Titanic. First one, of course, is Thomas Andrews, the builder of the Titanic. When the ship was going down, he helped a lot of people get into life jackets, get into boats, but he never tried. The last they see of him, he was standing in the first class lounge, staring at a picture over the fireplace. Never made a try. Next is, on the upper level, is Charles Lightoller, who was the second officer, senior officer that survived. He wrote a book about it, and while he may have painted a little more positive about the shipping line, he was very, very influential in saving people. The next is Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, again, one of my favorites. He was in charge of loading boats. He loaded boats. He went down, obviously one boat he was on. When he got down there, he had been a sailor as well as a seaman, which means he was used to sailing vessels. So he got 2 or 3 of the boats and put them together, raised a sail. All the boats had sails, but nobody knew what to do with them except him. And he was the only one that went back to try to rescue people that were left in the water. He did not find very many, but he did try, and he was the only one that tried. In the bottom left is Jack Phillips, who was the senior Marconi officer. Read that as radio operator. They were called Marconis back then, and they were basically telegraphs, but wireless telegraphs. He died. He was at his post until almost the end, and he did pass away. He was not saved. The next one is the Countess of Rhodes, who was Scottish, and she, well, she was one of the people. She took the tiller of one of the lifeboats and steered the lifeboats like a crew member. And the last one is Wallace Hartley, who was the director or the leader of the Titanic musicians. He also, all the Titanic musicians passed away, were lost. There's all sorts of stories, but there's two that I like to share. One is the Allisons. Hudson Allison and his wife, Bee, and their two children, Lauren and Sydney. Now, they were one of the latter people to actually come up on deck. And the husband went up on deck to see. Mrs. Allison looked around and basically got hysterical. On the right is their nanny, Alice Cleaver. Well, when Mrs. Hudson got hysterical, Anne took the baby, Sid, and took him up to get in a boat without telling Mrs. Hudson. The Hudsons, not knowing where the baby had gone, spent the rest of the night looking for him on the Titanic, not getting into a lifeboat because they wouldn't without him. And they ended up being lost. Lorraine is the only first-class child that passed away. The French twins, the orphans of the Titanic, their father, whose name was Navratil, was separated from his wife. He kidnapped the boys to take them across to America. Well, he was lost, but the boys were saved. But they had no idea who they were. And they're small enough, as you can tell, it was hard for them to say a whole lot, as well as they only spoke French. So they were taken care of, and a lot of the newspapers in the world put stories with pictures in them. Well, Mama finally saw one of the pictures, recognized the boys, came over to America and got them. The last words Mr. Navratil used was, "Tell your mother that I, truly loved her." One of the problems with this is Mr. Navratil used a pseudonym on the Titanic. He called himself Mr. Hoffman. When they were burying him, his body was recovered. When they were burying him, they looked and said, "Hoffman, he's probably Jewish." So they buried him in the Jewish cemetery. Then they moved him back when they realized what had happened. The vessel that saved them was the Carpathia. It was the closest. Captain Rostron there. When the Carpathia got the word, they turned right around to save the Titanic as much as they could. They were 58 miles or 4 hours away, and the Titanic sank in 2.5. But he put every ounce of steam he could into the engines. It was a marvelous rescue operation. He did manage to save, as I said, 705 people. He later was given a gold medal, and he was praised very much as the savior. The Carpathia, his ship, was a rival line. It was a canard line, and it was lost. It was sunk during World War I when it was converted to a troop ship. Captain Rostron, when he knew that they were going to go save the Titanic, he just started issuing orders for them to go as fast as they could. Doctors would be stationed here and there. There would be ladders and sling bags at the gangways. You can't imagine him. He covered everything, and he covered it so fast just off the top of his head. Okay, my cousin. My cousin was Thomason Beattie, and he was a real estate magnate in Saskatchewan, though he was born in Ontario. The picture on the right is him and his buddies. He is all the way on the right without the odd little haircut he had. His stone, again, it says drowned at sea. We know that he died of hypothermia. He's one of the few ones we can tell. Because a month after the Titanic sank, another cruise ship that was like 200 miles away from where the Titanic sank ran into a lifeboat. The lifeboat had 3 people in it. 2 of them were stewards from the dining room, and the third one was Thomason in white tie and tails. So, I mean, obviously he had died of hypothermia, not drowning. So they buried him at sea and then let his family know. So the stone is a cenotaph, which represents the man. It doesn't mean there's something buried underneath it. But he was the last first-class passenger picked up. Lifeboats, that gives you an idea what they were stuck in. They hold about 60 people. And you can see along the, in the middle, there would be where the sail masts would be in like that, which nobody knew how to use except for Fifth Officer Lowe. In the bottom is one of the collapsible. They had 16 regular lifeboats and they had 4 collapsibles, only 2 of which, if I remember right, they got working. These are basically boats with a wooden bottom, but the sides are canvas. And they were left on top of some of the cabins, especially the officer cabins, and they were a real problem to try to get down to launch. The Carpathia comes to New York, and they let people off. You had to have somebody there that knew you, or you had to have X amount of money in your wallet to be able to support yourself. Well, a lot of those people would, but some of them wouldn't, and they were shipped back. One of which was, I mentioned her earlier, Eva Hart. They had no money with them. The husband, the father had obviously had been lost at sea. So they shipped them back. Eva Hart ended up getting Order of the British Empire, the OBE. She had been a probate judge. She had done all these wonderful things, but she had been turned away from New York. But a lot of them were taken and put in either hospitals or hotels, or people took them home, or whatever, including like our French twins there. They were taken care of by actually one of the survivors who spoke French. Now, after the Titanic sunk, White Star Line paid for the recovery of bodies. First time that had happened. They ended up hiring the McKee Bennett, which was a cable laying ship, which you can tell by the front, the bow. It got there about a week after the Titanic sank. There were still a lot of bodies in life jackets, so they could pick those up. They would send a small, like a lifeboat or whatever, out to pick them up and then bring them aboard. They had a priority set that if the body was first class, they would embalm it on deck and then put it in a casket. If they were second class, or very easily identified, they would basically be put on ice until they could get back. If they were not identifiable, keeping in mind these boats or these people have been floating around for a week out in the Atlantic, they were buried at sea. And that's, the boats, and they were the morgue where you see the bodies in the caskets was a curling rink, actually. Of course, it would have ice. So that's what they used for the morgue. And I read I saw one video where the person said, "Oh, how very Canada of them," using a skating or a curling rink. They were buried, the bodies that were brought, some were returned, such as John Jacob Astor, the Strausses, or Mr. Strauss, Ida was never found, would be returned to where they lived. A lot of the other ones were buried at Halifax. They were either identified or bodies that were in too good of shape but were not identified. And they were buried here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. They were buried either in the municipal cemetery, which this is, or the Jewish cemetery. And the rabbi there got a little over-enthusiastic over who was Jewish. So there were a few of them they had to move back once it was proven they weren't. Probably the most popular grave there at Halifax. If you remember in the James Cameron movie, the two protagonists are Jack and Rose. And Jack is lost at sea and Rose, lives on till they find the Titanic. And the one thing that James Cameron always said was there would be no one on the ship with those actual names. So there was never any confusion. Well, unfortunately, there was one. However, he was called Joseph Dawson. He was an engineer. That's his picture on the left. No, he doesn't look like Leonardo DiCaprio. Again, he died April 15th, but it gets a lot of flowers. It's a very popular gravestone there. Titanic appears a lot in fiction. This is Upstairs, Downstairs, which was a British program, a lot like Dalton Abbey. And in it, Lady Marjorie, the woman in the front, actually dies on the Titanic. It was a great conceit for literature or whatever to have somebody die on the Titanic. So there are a lot of fictional people. When the Titanic went down, it lost a lot of stuff, dishes and furniture and all sorts of stuff. That's called the debris field when it hits the bottom, and that's how they actually found the Titanic itself. A lot of stories end up about the Titanic, one of which is the suicide. The story has always been that First Officer Murdoch, who was the officer on the bridge when the Titanic hit the iceberg, committed suicide. Now, a lot of people that knew him said, no, he wouldn't have done that. His family said, no, he wouldn't have done that. However, in the James Cameron movie, he does. He shoots himself in the head. And the family then ends up suing James Cameron over this, but that's always been one of the stories. A lot of sheet music was put out at that time. That was sort of where today you could have a video on YouTube that would be in memory of someone. Back then they used sheet music. I think it was in the first year, there were 60 different pieces of music that were published about the Titanic. 60, and probably 56 of them were crap. I couldn't think of a better word. They weren't very good, but they were there. The one on the right, the Titanic disaster, and you can see it has Hebrew writing on it, that is dedicated to the Strausses, Isidore and Ida, because they were Jewish. However, especially with English, they were willing to basically make anybody that was a hero an honorary Anglo-Saxon. So this was sort of to remind people that no, this wasn't. The movies are, to me, the most fascinating. The one on the left, Saved from the Titanic, was made by a survivor, Dorothy Gibson, like a month after the Titanic sank. The next one, The Atlantic, which is the first real movie, it was put out in, one of the first sound, put out in 27, I think. It's called The Atlantic because White Star Line wouldn't let them use the word Titanic. Third one, Titanic, was a Nazi propaganda film. It talks about the greed of the British, how they were basically paying no attention to people's lives. And the first officer, the hero is the first officer who happened to be German, not William Murdoch, who wasn't. Anyway, he's the one that saved people, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. Except when they started making this movie, everything was going great for Germany. When the movie finally was done and came out, there were air raids constantly. People were dying. Mobs of people were panicking. So they never released it in Germany. Titanic is 1953, Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck. It's a typical Titanic story. It has this romance. Those two are married. They're trying to save their marriage. The one big thing is these are very rich people, and they have a cottage mansion on an island between the upper and the lower peninsulas of Michigan. And it's a beautiful island. And they consistently call it Mackinac Island through the entire movie. Just a little bit more research would have helped on that. Night to Remember is based on a book. It is the only movie that's come out that's actually just about the Titanic, which is a compelling story in itself. Then there's the James Cameron Titanic, which again has the romance, but it's still very accurate about the ship and the sinking. In fact, some of the scenes in Titanic, the James Cameron, are lifted almost verbatim from the A Night to Remember. 1985, they'd been looking for the Titanic for years. Robert Ballard finally finds it in 1985. They have proof that the Titanic broke in two. They figured the front end was already full of water, so it just sort of landed, and the back end was not, so it imploded, basically. A musical about the Titanic. Well, they have musicals about Bonnie and Clyde and all sorts of other things, so it makes sense. Lots of books. But the two that are actually important is one, A Night to Remember, which was put out about 56, I think, by Walter Lord. Very good, very accurate, very readable. And it was the first book in many, many years that had been put out about Titanic. And the movie A Night to Remember is based on it. The other one is Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. This was written 14 years before the Titanic, about a steamship that hits an iceberg and sinks in the North Atlantic that happens to be 800 feet long, about 50 tons, not enough lifeboats, sinks and loses a great many people. And again, this was written 14 years before the Titanic. So everybody is sort of going, oh, was this prophecy? Was this psychic or whatever? Odd movies. Titanic 2, of course, is when Jack comes back. He had been frozen and he eventually comes back. And The Race the Titanic was based on a Clive Cussler book about raising the Titanic to get something out of a safe. It did not do well. One of the producers then said, you know, it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic. One of the common things is about what the hymn was when they were sinking. And almost every movie has it as Nearer My God to Thee, the American tune, the tune we're all used to. Nearer my God to thee, nearer to thee. However, the band was all British. They weren't used to American hymns. So they would most likely have played the British tune, which is called Horbury. Nearer my God to thee, nearer to thee, e'en though it be a cross that raiseth me. Much more accurate. That is assuming that the hymn was played. People that quote Nearer My God to Thee were all too far away to hear, like half mile away in a lifeboat. So we don't know. One of the assistant wireless operator told people that he remembered the last thing they were playing was a song called Autumn, which they all assumed was the hymn tune Autumn. Now, nobody uses hymn tunes unless you're an affected church musician, which, yes, I am. Everybody else uses like the first line. This man had no musical training. What he actually was referring to was a popular piece of music in Europe called the Song of Autumn. Other people say they played ragtime or they didn't play anything at all. Jack Thayer found an artist who gave them an idea. He shows the ship breaking in half, but nobody believed him then. And that is my presentation. I would answer or welcome any comments, keeping in mind that this is a personal view. It does not cover every fact involved, because we're sort of limited on time, and I could go on 2 or 3 hours about this. But anyway, that's the presentation. If you're going to read a book, it would be definitely A Night to Remember. And he has a sequel called The Night Lives On. If you're going to see a movie, I think most of us have seen James Cameron's Titanic or A Night to Remember. Excuse me, those would be the most accurate ones.
May I have your attention, please? Al, it looks like one of our Zoom participants was asking, do you have a Facebook?
Yes, it's albryant.wix.com/CA Heritage. We have a small business implies you make money, and we don't. A small business that does historical research and presentations. So that's what CA Heritage is.
I had a question now. When you mentioned that people were pulled from the water and you said they were separated by who they were, first class and such, how did they know?
Mostly by what they were wearing, or perhaps something that was in their pockets. When they found John Jacob Astor, he had something like $2,400 in his pocket. In 1912, $2,400. So yes, they figured right away who it was. And then there would be mistakes on who it was and like that. But primarily they could look at and pretty much tell the first class people. Any other questions?
We have another question from our
Okay.
Facebook. How many bodies were recovered by the
By the Mackie Bennett? The bodies were recovered by the Mackie Bennett, and I think they came up with 354, something like that. The Carpathia only picked up survivors, and that was 705. Any bodies that were left in boats or whatever, they just left because they weren't, they weren't set up or equipped to take care of that kind of thing. And their biggest concern were the survivors.
Someone, sorry, Al. Someone wants to know if you liked the Titanic movie from James Cameron.
Yes, I like it. I don't particularly like Cal, the bad guy, the jerk that was trying to marry Rose, but that's a personal thing. But as far as the ship is concerned, it is very accurate. It's very entertaining, very mesmerizing. It takes you into a lot of the actual things that you might not think about. You might not realize that, yes, this was something they had to be concerned with, that this was something, like one of the things is when the grand staircase lets loose with the water coming in, and at one point the grand staircase just basically explodes, which is what would have happened, but we don't think of that. We don't think of things like that. You sort of expect it all to be exactly like it was down there, and it isn't. About the only thing they have found that was exactly like it had been was what they called the Turkish baths, steam room and like that. And that had wonderful tile, and they have gotten in far enough to see the tile. Now, there is one other thing the Titanic has, is noted for. Titanic sank over 100 years ago, but there is still water in all of the swimming pools. You know what one of the odd things is doing this on Zoom? I keep expecting to hear laughter, and it doesn't happen. It's a very interesting experience. My wife always wanted to get me a t-shirt that had an outline of the Titanic sinking with the phrase on it, "The boat sank, get over it." But some of us have never gotten over it.
You mentioned that Jacob asked her they knew who he was because he had $2,400. I did a quick.
Have your attention, please. The
Hang on a
library is now
second.
closed for the evening.
I did a quick calculation, and $2,400 equates now to over $32,000.
Yeah. He was the richest man in the world. But yeah, and you can see why they automatically assume that. He also had like a handkerchief with his monogram on it, like that. Yeah, that's what he had in his pocket. Just chump change. Just, traveling money, carrying around money.
Okay, so does anybody have any more questions for Al?
Actually, I had one person ask if he could just repeat the Facebook page name one more time. I didn't write it
Okay.
down.
Certainly. It is Al Bryant, all one word, ALBRYANT, .wix, WIX, .com, / CA Heritage, all one word.
Is that your website or your Facebook?
That my website.
Okay, that's his website. Okay, anybody else? All right, doesn't look like it. So thank everyone for coming. I hope you all enjoyed it. Don't forget, in a couple of weeks, we have Nicole Beauchamp talking about her book. And Al, a lot of people are saying thank you and how much they enjoyed the program.
Well, great. Thank you for asking me. It's been a new experience doing it this way, but it's been fun, as I said, except for the laughter, because part of me deals with the feedback from the audience. But I always love doing these presentations. Basically, they're a hobby for me. I do probably about a dozen of them, and on all sorts of different subjects.
Okay, so everyone have a good evening. We're out of time, so we're going to shut down, and I hope you all have a good night. Thank you. Al, I will go ahead and send me that information I asked you for.
I will.
And have a good night.
Great. Well, thank you again. Thank you for asking me, Rochelle.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Certainly. Actually, people